No one wanted the blind girl, until the alpha vampire said, "She sees what others can't." The silver blade pierced through my heart, just as I realized I could see his soul burning like black fire in the darkness of my blindness. Wait, before the next revelation happens, if this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To make sure you don't miss any unexpected alliances or awakened powers, subscribe and join our circle. The game is about to change. Now, back to the scene. Blood pooled beneath me on the cold stone floor of the cathedral as I gasped, my fingers clutching at the ornate hilt protruding from my chest. The irony wasn't lost on me. After 22 years of stumbling through a world I couldn't see, death would finally grant me the darkness I'd always known. But the vampire standing above me, his presence like ice against my skin, wasn't finished with me yet. Curious. His voice was velvet over steel, refined and ancient. Most humans scream when they die. Yours, smiling. I was smiling, though I hadn't realized it. For the first time in my life, I could see something. Him. Not his physical form, but the writhing shadows that comprised his essence. The centuries of hunger and loneliness that clung to him like a second skin. The blade in my chest burned, but this vision burned brighter. "I can see you," I whispered, blood trickling from the corner of my mouth. The vampire's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the abandoned cathedral. I felt him kneel beside me, his cold fingers hovering over the blade's handle. The scent of old roses and ancient earth filled my nostrils, a smell that should have been comforting, but instead spoke of graves and forgotten prayers. "What do you see?" His question held an urgency that surprised us both. "Pain," I said simply. "So much pain, it's turned your soul to smoke and shadows. But underneath—" I struggled to focus through the growing darkness at the edges of my consciousness. Underneath, there's still a spark, buried so deep you've forgotten it exists. The blade twisted slightly as he leaned closer, sending fresh waves of agony through my chest. But I could see more clearly now, his true form becoming sharper with each heartbeat that might be my last. He had been human once, beautiful in the way that artists carved angels. But centuries of feeding had worn grooves of cruelty into his ethereal features. "You're dying," he stated, though something in his tone suggested this bothered him more than it should. "I've been dying since I was born," I replied. "My father made sure of that." This was true. Marcus looked between us, understanding finally dawning in his eyes. We weren't just vampire and fledgling, we were partners, equals in power, if not in age. The connection that bound us together made us stronger than either could be alone, and that strength was something he had no hope of defeating. "The other hunters," he said, "they won't understand. They'll see this as betrayal." "Then make them understand," I replied, "or find new hunters who can see beyond the old prejudices. The world is changing, Father. You can change with it, or be left behind by it. The choice is yours." He was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with 22 years of certainty that was now crumbling around him. When he finally spoke, his voice was that of a broken old man rather than a righteous crusader. "I loved your mother so much," he said. "When she died, I thought the world had ended. I couldn't see past my own pain to what she would have wanted for you. She would have wanted you to love me," I said simply. "She would have wanted us to be a family, even with all our flaws and limitations. But it's too late for that now. Too much has been broken, too much damage done. The best we can hope for is peace. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding the finality in my words. He bent to retrieve his fallen cane, but left the silver blade where it lay, a symbolic abandonment of the weapon he'd planned to use against his own daughter. "Peace," he repeated, as if testing the word. "I'm not sure I remember how to live in peace." "Then learn," Lucian suggested, though his tone had gentled somewhat. "You have time, if you choose to use it wisely." My father straightened his shoulders, and for a moment I caught a glimpse of the man he might have been if grief hadn't poisoned his heart. "I'll try," he said. "I owe her that much at least." He turned to leave, then paused at the cathedral's entrance. "Serafina?" "Yes." "Be happy. Whatever else happens, whatever choices you make from here, be happy. Your mother would have wanted that for you above all else." And then he was gone, walking out into the London night with the weight of 22 years of mistakes on his shoulders. The other hunters melted away with him, their righteous crusade dissolved by their leader's moment of clarity. I stood in the silence that followed, marveling at how anticlimactic it felt. After years of dreaming about confronting my father, the reality had been almost disappointingly simple. Truth, it seemed, was a more powerful weapon than any silver blade. "How do you feel?" Lucian asked, echoing his question from the night of my transformation. "Free," I said, and meant it completely. For the first time in my life, truly free. He moved to stand beside me, his presence warm and comforting in the cool cathedral air. "What would you like to do with that freedom?" I considered the question, thinking about all the possibilities that stretched before us. We could travel, could explore the world beyond London's fog-shrouded streets. We could build something new, create a different kind of vampire society that didn't rely on fear and predation. We could simply exist together, two creatures who'd found in each other the connection they'd been seeking for so long. "Everything," I said finally. "I want to do everything I was never allowed to do, see everything I was never allowed to see. But most of all, I want to do it with you." Lucian's smile was radiant in the moonlight. "Then we will. We have eternity, after all." But eternity, I was about to discover, had a way of starting immediately. The first challenge came 3 nights later, as we prepared to leave London behind and begin our new existence. Word of Marcus Ashford's sudden change of heart had spread through the supernatural community like wildfire, creating ripples of confusion and opportunity that threatened to destabilize the delicate balance between vampires and hunters. "There's a problem," Lucian announced as he entered my chambers, his expression grim. "The council has called for a gathering." I looked up from the book I'd been reading, a treatise on vampire politics that Lucian had insisted I study. What council? The old ones, the first vampires turned in this region, those who've survived for over a millennium. They meet only when something threatens the established order. He sat on the edge of my bed, running a hand through his dark hair. "Your father's withdrawal from the hunt has created a power vacuum, and nature abhors vacuums." I could see the concern in his eyes, the way his jaw tightened when he was working through a complex problem. What do they want? To decide what to do about us, about the precedent we've set. Lucian's voice was carefully neutral, but I could sense the undercurrent of worry through our bond. For centuries, the relationship between vampires and hunters has been predictable. We hide, they hunt, occasionally one side gains a temporary advantage. But what we did, turning the enemy's daughter, creating a connection that transcends traditional boundaries, it changes everything. And they don't like change. They fear it. Fear leads to rash decisions, and rash decisions get people killed. I set aside my book, giving him my full attention. "When do we meet them?" "Tonight, at the Meridian Club." He named an exclusive gentlemen's club in Piccadilly that catered to London's supernatural elite. Serafina, I need you to understand, these aren't modern vampires trying to adapt to changing times. These are ancient predators who survived by being more cunning and ruthless than anything that's tried to destroy them. They won't be impressed by our bond or moved by our intentions. What will impress them? Lucian's smile was sharp as his fangs. Power, strength, the ability to prove we're more valuable as allies than as enemies. The Meridian Club occupied a 4-story Georgian townhouse that seemed unremarkable from the outside, exactly the point. Mortals passed by without a second glance, their attention sliding away from the building as if it were merely another piece of London's architectural background. But to supernatural senses, the place thrummed with power, centuries of accumulated magic that made the air itself feel thick and electric. We were met at the door by a pale woman whose age was impossible to determine. She might have been 30 or 300, her features possessing the timeless quality that came with extended vampirism. Her dress was the height of current fashion, but her eyes held the weight of eras. "Lord Blackthorne," she said, with a curtsy that managed to be both respectful and mocking. "Lady Ashford, the council awaits." Lady Ashford. The title felt strange, foreign, but I supposed it was accurate enough. I was no longer Marcus Ashford's unwanted daughter. I was Lucian's equal, his partner in both blood and purpose. The woman led us through corridors lined with portraits of men and women whose eyes seemed to follow our passage. I recognized some of them from Lucian's lessons, legendary vampires whose names had become whispered myths in mortal folklore. Here was Carmilla Karnstein, her beauty preserved in oils that couldn't quite capture the predatory intelligence in her gaze. There hung Victor Dracul, not the literary creation, but the real, historical figure whose exploits had inspired Stoker's imagination. "Impressive company," I murmured to Lucian. "The founding members," he replied. "Most of them are still alive, though they rarely involve themselves in modern affairs. When they do," he let the sentence hang, unfinished but ominous. The council chamber occupied the entire top floor of the building, its ceiling soaring to a glass dome that revealed the star-scattered sky above. 7 chairs were arranged in a semicircle, each occupied by a figure that radiated power like heat from a forge. At their center sat an 8th chair, currently empty, clearly meant for Lucian. "Ah, the prodigal son returns," said the woman in the central chair. She appeared to be in her 40s, with auburn hair and green eyes that held depths I couldn't fathom. "And he brings his little pet." I felt Lucian tense beside me, but his voice remained calm when he spoke. "Morgana, always such a pleasure to see you too." Morgana. Even I had heard that name whispered in the darker corners of supernatural London. One of the oldest vampires in Britain, supposedly turned during the reign of the first Elizabeth. She'd been beautiful once, still was, in the terrible way that ancient predators could be beautiful. But centuries of accumulated cruelty had carved harsh lines around her perfect features. "Sit," she commanded, gesturing to the empty chair. "We have much to discuss." Lucian moved to take his place among the council, but I remained standing where I was. The slight was intentional. They'd provided no chair for me, making it clear that I was here as an object of discussion rather than a participant in it. "The girl may observe," Morgana continued, "but she will not speak unless spoken to." "I think you'll find my understanding is quite adequate," I said pleasantly, ignoring Lucian's warning look. "After all, I am the subject of this little gathering, aren't I?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Morgana's green eyes fixed on me with predatory focus, and I felt the weight of her power pressing against my mind like a physical force. "Insolent child," she hissed. "You forget yourself. You forget what you are. A fledgling, barely a week old, created by sentiment rather than wisdom. You have no voice here." "Don't I?" I met her gaze steadily, drawing on the connection between Lucian and myself to fortify my mental defenses. I'm the one who turned Marcus Ashford from hunter to ally. I'm the one whose transformation has created this unprecedented situation you're all so concerned about. If anyone should have a voice in these proceedings, it's me. Morgana started to rise from her chair, power crackling around her like visible lightning. But the vampire to her left placed a restraining hand on her arm. "Peace, sister," he said in accented English that spoke of centuries in continental Europe. "The child has a point. We cannot discuss her fate without hearing her perspective." This was Nikolai Volkov, the Russian vampire whose exploits had terrified the Tsars for 3 centuries. He looked younger than Morgana, perhaps 30 at the time of his turning, but his dark eyes held an intelligence that was both brilliant and utterly without mercy. "Thank you," I said, inclining my head toward him. "I appreciate the courtesy." Nikolai smiled, revealing fangs that gleamed like ivory daggers. "Do not mistake pragmatism for kindness, little one. I simply prefer to understand all aspects of a problem before I decide how to solve it." A third council member leaned forward in her chair, a dark-skinned woman whose features suggested Egyptian origins. "The question before us is simple," she said in a voice like honey over steel. "What do we do about the precedent these two have set? For centuries, the balance has been maintained through careful separation. Vampires and hunters exist in opposition, each checking the other's power. But if hunters can be turned, if they can become allies rather than enemies, the entire structure collapses," finished the vampire to her right, a pale man whose northern European features were set in perpetual winter. "Chaos follows, war follows, and in war, we all lose. Unless," said Nikolai thoughtfully, "we ensure that this precedent works in our favor rather than against it." All eyes turned to him. Nikolai Volkov was not just one of the oldest vampires in the council. He was one of the most politically astute, a master of the game of nations who'd outlasted monarchies and republics alike. "Explain," Morgana demanded. "Marcus Ashford was not just any hunter," Nikolai said, rising from his chair to pace before the assembled council. "He was their leader, their most effective weapon against our kind. His conversion to our cause, for make no mistake, that is what has happened here, removes their greatest asset and potentially provides us with invaluable intelligence about their operations." "You're suggesting we use him," I said, understanding dawning. "I'm suggesting we use the situation you've created," Nikolai corrected. "Ashford's sudden change of heart has left the Order in chaos. Hunters are questioning their mission, doubting their leaders, wondering if they've been on the wrong side all along. Or, Morgana interjected coldly, we could eliminate the problem at its source. Kill the girl, destroy Blackthorn, and make it clear to any would-be converts that such alliances are not tolerated." The room fell silent, tension crackling between the council members like electricity before a storm. I could sense Lucian's readiness to fight, could feel his muscles coiling for action if Morgana made good on her implicit threat. "That would be unwise," said a new voice from the shadows near the chamber's entrance. Every head turned toward the speaker, and I felt a collective intake of breath from the assembled vampires. The figure that emerged from the darkness was tall and aristocratic, dressed in clothing that seemed to shift between medieval robes and modern evening wear depending on the angle of observation. His face was ageless and beautiful in the way that only truly ancient creatures could be beautiful. But it was his eyes that commanded attention. Silver like starlight, holding depths that spoke of millennia rather than mere centuries. "Lord Merrion," Morgana breathed, and for the first time since I'd met her, she sounded uncertain. "We did not expect." "I know exactly what you expected," the newcomer said smoothly, moving to the center of the chamber with fluid grace. "You expected to make decisions about the future of our kind without consulting those who built that future in the first place." Lord Merrion. The name was legend among vampires, spoken in the same tones mortals reserved for discussing gods or demons. He was supposedly the first vampire turned in Britain, created during the Roman occupation and alive ever since. I'd assumed he was myth, a story told to impress fledglings and frightened hunters. Apparently, I'd been wrong. "My lord," Lucian said, rising from his chair and offering a bow that was respectful without being subservient. "I had hoped you might take an interest in recent events." Merrion's silver gaze moved to me, and I felt as if I were being examined by something infinitely vast and ancient. "Indeed. The young lady who has managed to accomplish in a week what diplomats and politicians have failed to achieve in centuries." "I'm not sure I understand," I said carefully. "Peace, child." The beginnings of genuine peace between our peoples. Meridian moved closer, and I caught the scent of old parchment and forgotten libraries, of knowledge accumulated across ages. For too long, vampires and hunters have been locked in a cycle of violence that serves no one. Your transformation represents the possibility of something different. "A dangerous possibility," Morgana protested. "If hunters begin converting en masse, then we will have allies instead of enemies," Meridian finished calmly. "Tell me, Morgana, in your 4 centuries of existence, how many hunters have you killed?" "Dozens," she replied proudly. "And how many new hunters were trained to replace them?" Morgana's expression faltered. Hundreds, I suppose." "Precisely. Violence begets violence. Hatred breeds hatred. We have been fighting the same war for millennia with no hope of victory because victory itself was impossible. But what young Seraphina and Lord Blackthorn have shown us is a different path, one that leads not to victory but to something far more valuable." "Which is?" asked the Egyptian vampire. "Evolution," Meridian said simply. "The chance for both our species to grow beyond the limitations that have defined us for so long." He turned back to me, and I found myself straightening under that ancient gaze. "Tell me, child, what do you see when you look at the future?" The question seemed to require more than a simple answer. I closed my eyes, reaching out with the enhanced senses that vampirism had given me, trying to perceive the currents of possibility that flowed around us. What I saw took my breath away. "Change," I said finally. "Fundamental, irreversible change. The old boundaries breaking down, new alliances forming. Vampires and humans working together instead of against each other. But," I paused, seeing darker currents alongside the hopeful ones, "but also resistance, fear, those on both sides who would rather fight than adapt." "And what do you propose we do about that resistance?" I opened my eyes, meeting Meridian's silver stare with growing confidence. "We prove them wrong. We show both vampires and humans that cooperation is more profitable than conflict. We build something new, something that benefits everyone involved. Idealistic nonsense, Morgana spat. Humans will never accept us as equals. They fear what they don't understand, and they destroy what they fear. Some do, I admitted, but not all. My father was one of the most feared vampire hunters in England, and even he was capable of change when shown the truth. If Marcus Ashford can be turned from enemy to ally, anyone can. And if you're wrong, asked the Northern European vampire, if this grand experiment of yours leads to exposure, to war, to the destruction of everything we've built, I felt Lucian's presence beside me, felt the strength of our bond flowing between us like a current of electricity. Then we'll face those consequences together. But I'd rather risk everything trying to build a better world than spend eternity hiding in the shadows of the old one. Meridian smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face. Spoken like a true visionary. Very well, the Council will support this experiment, with certain conditions. What conditions? Lucian asked, though I could sense his relief through our bond. First, you will establish a formal covenant between reformed hunters and cooperative vampires. Rules, boundaries, expectations, all clearly defined to prevent misunderstandings that could lead to violence. Agreed, I said. Second, you will be held personally responsible for the actions of any hunters you convert. Their crimes become your crimes. Their successes, your successes. Understood. And third, Meridian's expression grew serious, you will report regularly to this council on the progress of your efforts. We are granting you unprecedented freedom, but we will not do so blindly. I looked at Lucian, seeing my own determination reflected in his dark eyes. We accept your terms. Excellent. Meridian clapped his hands together, and the sound echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. Then I believe this meeting is concluded. You have much work ahead of you. The other council members began to file out, some looking pleased, others clearly skeptical of the decision. Morgana paused beside my chair as she passed. Do not mistake this for acceptance, child, she said quietly. There are those among us who will be watching for any sign of failure, any excuse to end this experiment permanently. Do not give them that excuse. I won't, I replied, but thank you for the warning. She studied me for a moment longer, then nodded curtly and swept from the chamber. Soon, only Lucian, Meridian, and I remained. That went better than I expected, Lucian said, relaxing for the first time since we'd entered the building. Did it? Meridian asked. Morgana is not your only enemy on the council. There are others who will work to undermine your efforts, who see change as a threat to their accumulated power. Then we'll have to make sure our successes are too obvious to ignore, I said. Meridian's smile returned. I believe you will. But remember, you are no longer fighting for yourselves alone. The future of both our peoples may well depend on what you accomplish in the coming months. The weight of that responsibility should have been overwhelming, but instead I felt energized by it. For the first time in my life, I had a purpose that mattered, work that could make a real difference in the world. We won't let you down, I promised. I know you won't, Meridian replied. After all, you've already accomplished the impossible once. I have faith you can do it again. 3 weeks later, we held our first official meeting between reformed hunters and progressive vampires in the drawing room of Lucian's Mayfair mansion. The gathering was small, only 6 participants beyond ourselves, but it represented a fundamental shift in the supernatural world's power structure. Marcus Ashford sat stiffly in a wingback chair, still struggling to adapt to his new role as ally rather than enemy. Beside him sat James Morrison, a younger hunter who'd followed his leader's example after witnessing the transformation in his mentor's perspective. They faced 3 vampires across the polished mahogany table, Lady Catherine Worthington, a Victorian-era vampire who ran a successful import business. Dr. Edmund Hayes, a physician turned vampire during the Crimean War, who now worked to develop better relations between supernatural and mortal medical communities. And, surprisingly, Nikolai Volkov himself, who'd volunteered to serve as the council's official observer. "The first order of business," I said, reading from the agenda Lucian and I had prepared, "is establishing guidelines for interaction between our communities. For too long, contact has meant conflict. We need to change that pattern." "Easier said than done," Morrison muttered. 20 years of training don't disappear overnight. When I see a vampire, my first instinct is still to reach for a steak. "And when I see a hunter, mine is to prepare for battle," Lady Worthington replied coolly. "But instincts can be retrained, Mr. Morrison. The question is whether we're both willing to make the effort." "What are you proposing?" Marcus asked. It was the first time he'd spoken since the meeting began, and his voice was carefully neutral. "Gradual integration," Lucian answered. "Joint patrols to deal with rogue vampires who refuse to follow the new protocols. Shared intelligence about supernatural threats that endanger both communities. Perhaps, eventually, formal partnerships between reformed hunters and established vampires." "Partners," Dr. Hayes mused. "It has a nice sound to it. Better than mortal enemies, certainly." The conversation continued for hours, covering everything from territorial disputes to feeding rights to the proper protocol for introducing newly turned vampires to the community. It was tedious work, the kind of careful negotiation that built lasting peace one compromise at a time. But as the evening wore on, I began to see something remarkable happening. The participants were beginning to see each other not as natural enemies, but as individuals with legitimate concerns and common goals. Morrison and Lady Worthington discovered a shared interest in protecting mortal civilians from supernatural threats. Dr. Hayes and Marcus found common ground in their desire to reduce unnecessary violence. "This could actually work," Morrison said, as the meeting was winding down. "It's going to take time, and there'll be setbacks, but this could really work." "It has to work," Marcus said quietly. "The alternative is more of the same, endless war with no hope of resolution. I've seen where that path leads, and I won't walk it anymore." After the others had gone, Lucian and I stood together in the drawing room, looking out at the gas-lit streets of London. The city hummed with life around us, mortal and immortal, hunter and hunted, all existing in the same space for perhaps the first time in centuries without active hostility. "One meeting down," Lucian said. "Several hundred to go." "Are you having second thoughts?" I asked, though I could sense the answer through our bond. "Never." He turned to face me, his dark eyes bright with determination. "This is what I've been waiting 8 centuries for. A chance to build something better than what came before. A chance to prove that monsters and heroes don't have to be enemies." I smiled, feeling my fangs extend slightly in the expression. "Even if we are a little of both?" "Especially then," he replied, pulling me into his arms. After all, who better to bridge the gap between light and darkness than creatures who embody both? Outside, London slept under a canopy of stars, unaware that the ancient war between vampires and hunters had taken its first tentative steps toward peace. But in a mansion in Mayfair, 2 unlikely lovers had begun the work of rewriting the rules that had governed the supernatural world for millennia. The blind girl no one had wanted had found her sight, her purpose, and her place in a world that was finally ready to change. And the ancient vampire, who'd thought himself doomed to eternal loneliness, had discovered that sometimes the most powerful transformations began with a single act of unexpected mercy. Together, they faced a future full of challenges and possibilities, secure in the knowledge that whatever came next, they would meet it side by side. The night was theirs, and for the first time in centuries, that felt like enough. Final report, body word count, CTA included, 12,003. Ashford had never wanted a blind daughter, especially not one whose birth had cost him his beloved wife. From the moment I drew my first breath, he'd made it clear that I was nothing but a burden, a mistake that cost too much to maintain and brought nothing but shame to the family name. He'd locked me away in the servants' quarters, told the world I'd died in infancy, and left me to survive on scraps and the occasional kindness of the kitchen maids who dared to defy him. The vampire's head tilted, a predatory gesture that should have terrified me. Instead, I found it almost endearing, like a wolf trying to understand a wounded bird. Your father. The words held a weight that made the cathedral's ancient stones seem to groan. Marcus Ashford. It wasn't a question. Of course he knew my father. Everyone in London's supernatural underworld knew Marcus Ashford, vampire hunter, leader of the Order of the Silver Cross, the man who had spent the last decade systematically hunting down every vampire in England. What they didn't know was that he kept his own daughter prisoner in the cellars of his grand estate, hidden away like a shameful secret. "He doesn't know you're here," the vampire continued, and I could hear the wheels turning in his ancient mind. "Doesn't know his weapon found its mark in his own blood." The weapon? I'd almost forgotten about the silver blade currently decorating my chest like some macabre piece of jewelry. It belonged to my father, one of his prized vampire-killing instruments, blessed by priests and forged with prayers that were supposed to make it deadly to the undead. I'd stolen it from his study 3 nights ago, along with the information about this meeting, a secret gathering of London's remaining vampire coven in the ruins of St. Bartholomew's Cathedral. I hadn't come here to kill anyone. I'd come here to die. Serafina. The vampire spoke my name like a prayer, and I wondered how he knew it. Why? Such a simple question with such a complicated answer. Why had I stolen my father's blade? Why had I tracked down London's most dangerous vampire? Why had I driven that silver steel into my own heart the moment he'd appeared before me like death in a tailored coat? "Because I'm tired of being no one," I said, feeling the strength ebb from my limbs. 22 years of existing in the shadows, of being the daughter who doesn't exist, the burden who costs too much to keep but can't be discarded. At least this way, my death will mean something. The great Marcus Ashford's silver blade stained with the blood of his own child in the heart of vampire territory. It will drive him mad. The vampire was quiet for a long moment, his cold presence the only thing anchoring me to consciousness. When he finally spoke, his voice held a note I hadn't expected. Respect. "You would die for revenge against a man who never deserved to call himself your father. I would die to finally matter to someone, even if it's only as a weapon of madness," I corrected. "Besides, what's the alternative? Crawl back to that cellar and wait for him to decide I've lived too long? Pretend that 22 years of starvation and isolation can somehow transform into a life worth living? There is another alternative." The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. I felt his fingers finally close around the blade's handle, but instead of the final twist I expected, he began to withdraw it slowly, carefully. The pain was excruciating, but something else was happening too. A strange warmth was spreading through my chest, knitting torn flesh back together with each fraction of an inch the blade retreated. "What are you doing?" I gasped. "Giving you a choice your father never did." The blade came free with a wet sound that should have signaled my death, but instead I felt strength returning to my limbs. You can die here, as you planned, and become nothing more than a footnote in your father's descent into madness. Or, or, or you can live, really live. See the world as it truly is, not as they've told you it should be. But the price, he paused, and I could feel his ancient eyes studying me in the darkness. The price is everything you think you know about yourself. I pushed myself up onto my elbows, amazed that I could move at all. The hole in my dress was still there, stained with blood, but beneath it my skin was unmarked. Impossible. But then again, everything about this night had been impossible. You're offering to turn me. It wasn't a question. I could see it in the shadows that comprised his essence, the hunger, the need, the terrible loneliness that had driven him to make this offer to a dying girl he'd known for less than an hour. "I'm offering to free you from a cage made of other people's limitations," he said, "to give you power your father could never imagine, sight that goes beyond what human eyes can perceive. But I won't lie to you, it's not a gift. It's a transformation that will change everything you are, everything you've ever been." The smart thing would have been to refuse, to accept death with dignity, rather than become the very thing my father had dedicated his life to destroying. But I'd never been particularly smart, and dignity was a luxury I'd never been able to afford. "What's your name?" I asked instead. A pause, as if he hadn't expected the question. Lucian Blackthorn. Even blind, even sheltered, I knew that name. Lucian Blackthorn, the alpha vampire, the one my father's order had been hunting for decades, the creature responsible for turning half of London's vampire population, the monster who'd supposedly orchestrated the deaths of dozens of hunters. He was standing in front of me, offering me immortality, and all I could think was that his voice didn't sound like a monster's. "Why?" I asked, echoing his earlier question. "Because," he said, and for the first time since I'd stabbed myself, he sounded uncertain. "Because in 800 years of existence, you're the first person who's ever seen me, really seen me, not just the monster or the myth. And because," he stopped, seeming to struggle with words that had probably never been spoken aloud. "Because I'm tired of being alone." The honesty in those words hit me harder than the silver blade had. Here was the most feared vampire in England, confessing his loneliness to a blind girl he'd just met, offering her immortality not out of cruelty or hunger, but out of a desperate need for connection. It should have been laughable, but instead it was heartbreaking. I could see the truth of it written in the shadows of his soul, centuries of isolation, of watching everyone he'd ever cared about age and die while he remained unchanged. The monster my father hunted wasn't driven by evil, but by a loneliness so profound it had carved hollows in his immortal heart. "If I say yes," I said carefully, "what happens to Marcus Ashford?" Lucian's laugh was dark silk wrapped around broken glass. "What would you like to happen to him?" The question hung in the air like a promise of retribution. 22 years of abuse, of being told I was worthless, of existing in the shadows while he played the righteous hero to the world above. All of it could be answered with a single word. "I want him to know," I said finally. "I want him to know that his greatest enemy saved the daughter he threw away. I want him to understand that his own flesh and blood chose the darkness over the light he claimed to represent. That can be arranged, and I want him to live with it. Death is too easy, too quick. I want him to spend the rest of his natural life knowing that everything he fought against, everything he hated, runs in his veins now." Lucian's approval radiated from him like heat. "You have a talent for revenge, Seraphina Ashford. I think you'll adapt to immortality quite well." He moved closer, and I could sense his intentions before he acted. The bite, when it came, was nothing like the violent attack I'd imagined. His fangs pierced the soft skin of my throat with surgical precision, and instead of pain, there was only a strange euphoria, a sense of falling into warm darkness. But as my mortal blood flowed into him, something unexpected happened. The connection that had allowed me to see his soul deepened, became a two-way bridge between us. I felt his memories rushing into me, 8 centuries of existence, love and loss, the weight of decisions that had shaped the supernatural world. And through our bond, I knew he was experiencing my memories too, seeing through my eyes the years of isolation and abuse, understanding the depth of determination it had taken to orchestrate this meeting. When he finally pulled away, offering me his rest to complete the transformation, I understood that this was more than vampirism. Whatever power had allowed me to see his true nature was amplifying the turning, creating a connection between us that went far deeper than the typical bond between sire and progeny. I bit down without hesitation, and his blood was like liquid starlight, rewriting every cell in my body with fire and shadow. The transformation should have taken hours, should have been agony beyond description, but instead it felt like coming home after a lifetime of exile. When it was finished, when my heart had stopped beating and started again with a rhythm that would never cease, I opened my eyes and saw the world for the first time. The cathedral around us was magnificent in its decay, soaring arches that disappeared into darkness above, stained glass windows that cast rainbow patterns across ancient stones, centuries of prayers and secrets embedded in every surface. But more than that, I could see the threads of magic that connected everything, the ley lines of power that ran beneath London like a supernatural circulatory system. And I could see Lucian, really see him, not just the shadows of his soul, but his physical form as well. He was beautiful in the way that legends were beautiful, otherworldly, perfect, carved from moonlight and midnight. But it was the vulnerability in his dark eyes, the wonder as he looked at me, that took my breath away. "How do you feel?" he asked. I stood, marveling at the strength that flowed through my new body, the way every sense had been heightened beyond human comprehension. I could hear the heartbeats of rats in the walls, smell the fear of a night watchman 6 blocks away, taste the approaching dawn on the wind. "Powerful," I said, and meant it. "For the first time in my life, I feel powerful." Lucian smiled, and it transformed his entire face. "Good, you're going to need that power for what comes next." "Which is?" "War," he said simply. "Your father won't take this transformation lying down. When he discovers what's happened to you, he'll mobilize every hunter in England to destroy us both. The Order of the Silver Cross won't rest until they've driven stakes through our hearts and watched us burn." The prospect should have terrified me, but instead I felt a thrill of anticipation. Let them come. Let Marcus Ashford gather his righteous army and march against the daughter he'd discarded. They would find that the blind girl who'd cowered in cellars for 22 years no longer existed. "Then we'd better make sure we're ready for them," I said. Lucian's smile widened, showing the tips of his fangs. "I was hoping you'd say that." The next 7 nights passed in a blur of education and revelation. Lucian's estate in Mayfair was nothing like my father's austere manor. It was a place of beauty and luxury, filled with art and books and comforts I'd never known existed. But more than that, it was a place where I was welcome, where my presence was desired rather than merely tolerated. The mansion itself was a testament to 8 centuries of accumulated wealth and refined taste. Persian carpets covered polished marble floors, while paintings by masters whose names I'd only heard whispered in reverent tones adorned the walls. Lucian had collected not just art, but stories. Each piece had a history, a moment in time when he'd acquired it, often from artists he'd known personally. A Caravaggio here, a small sketch by Leonardo there. Books that contained knowledge lost to the mortal world. "Beauty is one of the few things that makes immortality bearable," he explained, as he showed me through the library on my second night. "When you've seen centuries pass, when everyone you've ever loved has turned to dust, art becomes a way of preserving what matters. These works outlive their creators, just as we outlive ours." I ran my fingers along the spine of a book written in a language I couldn't identify, feeling the weight of centuries in its binding. It must be lonely, watching the world change while you remain the same. "It was," he said, and I caught the past tense. "But loneliness is a choice, Serafina. I chose isolation because it seemed safer than risking loss again. You're helping me remember that some risks are worth taking." Lucian proved to be an exceptional teacher, patient with my questions and generous with his knowledge. He taught me to hunt without killing, showing me how to feed from willing donors who would remember our encounters as pleasant dreams rather than predatory attacks. The blood of the willing, he explained, was always sweeter than that taken by force, and it left both vampire and human strengthened rather than diminished. "Your father's order sees only one kind of vampire," Lucian said as we moved through London's shadows on my fourth night. "The kind that kills indiscriminately, that treats humans as nothing more than prey. But we have a choice in what we become. The hunger doesn't have to define us." He taught me to move through London's labyrinthine streets without being detected, to use the supernatural senses that came with vampirism to navigate a world that had suddenly become infinitely more complex. Every heartbeat told a story, every scent carried information, every shadow held potential danger or opportunity. But most importantly, he taught me about the world I'd inherited, the complex politics of vampire society, the ancient laws that governed supernatural creatures, the delicate balance that kept the mortal and immortal worlds from destroying each other. "There are factions," he explained, as we sat in his study on my fifth night, maps of London spread before us marked with territories and allegiances. The old vampires, who believe in the traditional ways, ruling through fear, maintaining the masquerade through violence. The young ones who want to integrate with human society, who think we can find a place in their world without deception. And those like me, who seek a middle path. I studied the maps, noting how the territories overlapped and competed. Where do you fit in this hierarchy? Technically, I'm what they call an alpha. Old enough and powerful enough to claim territory and command respect from other vampires. But I've never wanted to rule, never sought to build an empire. I've been content to exist on the periphery, to help when I can and otherwise mind my own affairs. And now, Lucian's dark eyes met mine across the table. Now I have something worth protecting, someone worth changing for. The connection between us had only grown stronger over the past few nights. I could sense his thoughts and emotions as clearly as my own, could anticipate his movements in combat as if we'd been fighting together for centuries. It was a bond that went beyond typical vampire relationships, something unprecedented in his 800 years of existence. During the day, while Lucian rested in the special chamber he'd constructed beneath the mansion, I explored my new abilities. The enhanced strength was exhilarating. I could lift furniture that would have required 3 strong men to move, could leap to the mansion's second story with barely any effort. My speed was equally impressive, allowing me to cross the length of the building in the blink of an eye. But it was the sight that fascinated me most. Not just the ability to see physical objects in perfect detail, but the supernatural perception that allowed me to observe the magical currents that flowed through everything. London itself was alive with power, ley lines that crisscrossed the city like a vast circulatory system, nodes of energy where supernatural creatures gathered and ancient rituals had been performed. I could see the history embedded in objects, the emotional resonance that clung to places where significant events had occurred. The mansion itself was layered with memories. Lucian's 8 centuries of residence had left traces of his presence in every room, moments of joy and sorrow that painted themselves across my enhanced vision like ghostly afterimages. On the 6th night, Lucian took me hunting in earnest for the first time. We stalked through the East End, where poverty and desperation made people vulnerable to predators both natural and supernatural. But instead of preying on the weak, Lucian led me to a different kind of quarry. There, he said, pointing to a well-dressed man emerging from an opium den. Lord Pemberton. He's been trafficking young girls to wealthy clients for the past 5 years. The authorities can't touch him because he owns half the judges in London. I could see the corruption clinging to the man like a second skin, the darkness that had accumulated around his soul through years of casual cruelty. What do? We give him a choice, Lucian said. The same choice your father never gave you. He can confess his crimes, make restitution to his victims, and spend the rest of his life trying to atone. Or we feed. We confronted Pemberton in an alley behind his club, cornering him away from witnesses and bodyguards. The man's terror was immediate and visceral when he saw us, some primal part of his mind recognizing the predators we'd become. "What do you want?" he stammered, pressing himself against the brick wall as if it might offer protection. "Justice," I said simply, enjoying the way he flinched at the sound of my voice. "For Catherine Morrison, aged 14. For Sarah Whitley, aged 16. For Emma Carstairs, aged 15. Shall I continue?" The blood drained from Pemberton's face as I recited the names of his victims. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie," Lucian interrupted, his voice carrying a compulsion that made the man's knees buckle. "We can smell the guilt on you, taste the fear of your victims in your sweat. The question is what you're going to do about it." We gave him the choice, exactly as promised. He could confess, could work to make amends, could try to find redemption for the horrors he'd inflicted. Or he could continue to deny, continue to profit from human misery, and face the consequences of his choices. Pemberton chose denial. He chose to threaten us with his connections, to promise retribution if we didn't leave him alone immediately. He chose to prove that some people were beyond redemption, that some monsters wore human faces and deserved no mercy. His blood was bitter with corruption, tainted by years of cruelty and selfishness. But beneath the bitterness was something else: relief. In his final moments, as his life drained away, Lord Pemberton experienced something he'd denied his victims: an end to suffering. "How do you feel?" Lucian asked as we disposed of the body, making it look like the result of a robbery gone wrong. "Satisfied," I said, surprised by my own honesty. He was a monster. The world is better without him. "And that doesn't disturb you, taking a life?" I considered the question as we made our way back through London's twisting streets. Should it? He made his choices, just as I've made mine. I'm not going to pretend that vampirism hasn't changed my moral compass, but I don't think it's changed it for the worse. If anything, I can see more clearly now what deserves protection and what deserves destruction. Lucian smiled at that, and I could sense his approval through our bond. You're adapting faster than I expected. Most new vampires struggle with the philosophical implications of predation. Most new vampires weren't raised by Marcus Ashford, I pointed out. I learned very early that the world is divided between those with power and those without it, between those who protect and those who prey. The only difference now is which side of that equation I'm on. On the seventh night, our peaceful existence came to an abrupt end. I woke at sunset to find Lucian standing at the window of my chambers, his body tense with predatory alertness. "What is it?" I asked, sitting up in the silk-draped bed he'd given me. "They've found us," he said, without turning around. "Your father's hunters are surrounding the estate as we speak." I could sense them too, now that I was fully awake. Dozens of heartbeats arranged in a careful perimeter around the mansion, the sharp scent of blessed silver and holy water carried on the evening breeze. Marcus Ashford had come for his wayward daughter, and he'd brought an army. "How many?" I asked, slipping out of bed and reaching for the dark clothing Lucian had provided for our nightly hunts. 40, perhaps 50. Every hunter the order could muster. He finally turned to face me, and I could see the calculation in his dark eyes. They're well-armed and highly trained. If we fight them here, innocents will die. The servants, I realized. Lucian employed a small staff of humans who helped maintain the mansion during daylight hours. They were loyal to him, had been for years, and deserved better than to be caught in the crossfire of a supernatural war. Then we don't fight them here. Lucian raised an eyebrow. "What do you suggest?" A plan was forming in my mind, born from 22 years of understanding Marcus Ashford's psychology. My father was many things. Cruel, obsessive, ruthlessly efficient, but above all, he was proud. He would never be able to resist the opportunity to confront his transformed daughter face to face, to try one last time to assert his dominance over the child who had finally slipped beyond his control. "We give him what he wants," I said, fastening a dark cloak around my shoulders. "A meeting, just the three of us." "Serafina, that's exactly what he's expecting me to refuse," I interrupted. "Marcus Ashford thinks he knows me, thinks I'm still the frightened girl who hid in the cellars. He's counting on me to run, to cower behind your protection. When I don't, when I walk into his trap willingly, it will shake his confidence." Lucian was quiet for a long moment, considering my words. "And if his confidence isn't shaken? If he simply kills us both?" I smiled, feeling my new fangs extend slightly. "Then he'll learn that his daughter is no longer quite so easy to kill." We left the mansion through a hidden passage that emerged in the mews behind the main building. The hunters had positioned themselves well, but their focus was on preventing escape, not infiltration. We made our way through London's twisting streets with supernatural speed and silence, arriving at the designated meeting place, the same abandoned cathedral where I'd begun my transformation, well ahead of our pursuers. St. Bartholomew's looked different through my enhanced vision. Where before I'd seen only shadows and decay, now I could perceive the layers of history embedded in every stone, the lingering traces of centuries of worship and desperation. It was a fitting place for a final confrontation between father and daughter, between the old world and the new. "He'll try to separate us," Lucian warned, as we took our positions in the cathedral's nave. "Marcus knows that together we're more dangerous than the sum of our parts." This was true. The connection forged during my transformation had only grown stronger over the past week. I could sense Lucian's thoughts and emotions as clearly as my own, could anticipate his movements in combat as if we'd been fighting together for centuries. It was a bond that went beyond typical vampire relationships, something unprecedented in his 800 years of existence. "Then we don't let him separate us," I said simply. The hunters arrived 20 minutes later, their boots echoing through the ruined cathedral like a marching armies. But it was Marcus Ashford who entered first, alone, his silver-headed cane tapping against the stone floor with each measured step. He looked exactly as I remembered him, tall, austere, with iron-gray hair and eyes like chips of winter ice. The years had carved new lines around those eyes, but the essential cruelty remained unchanged. He stopped 30 feet away from where we stood, his gaze moving between Lucien and myself with cold calculation. When his eyes finally settled on me, I saw something I'd never seen there before: uncertainty. Serafina. My name sounded strange on his lips, rusty from disuse. My wayward daughter.